A woman tries to swallow poison. Police phones ring off the hook. Cars speed out of driveways. All because of a radio show. Not a war, not a disaster. A story. The same exact trick that caused that panic in 1938 is the trick your ancestors used by Firelight 200 years earlier, just to keep their kids away from a poisoned well. One decision in one boardroom in 1916 is the reason both of those things happened. Stay to the end, and I'll show you exactly how a bedtime story became a weapon. Here's what actually happened that night. On the evening of October 30th, 1938, roughly 6 million Americans sat in their living rooms and listened to the end of the world. A voice on the radio described Martian war machines wading across the Hudson River, poison gas drifting over New Jersey, the collapse of New York City into flame. Some listeners called the police, some packed their cars. A woman in Pittsburgh reportedly tried to swallow poison rather than face what she believed was an invading army. It was not the news. It was a radio play. Orson Welles reading H.G. Wells over CBS, dressed up as a live broadcast interrupting a music program. Nobody in that studio expected panic. They got it anyway. And that single detail tells you almost everything about what radio, and the whole world of home entertainment before television, actually was. It was not a distraction. For a few hours a night, it was reality itself. That was 1938. But the story of how families filled their evenings starts long before anyone had heard of Orson Welles. Long before electricity. Long before the printing press even. It starts in the dark. For most of human history, night was not a time for entertainment. It was a time to survive. Before artificial light, sunset ended the working day and began a stretch of hours that had to be filled somehow. Without heat you could waste, without light you could spare, without any guarantee that tomorrow would be easier than today. In medieval and early modern Europe, rural households faced roughly 10 to 14 hours of darkness a night for half the year. A single tallow candle, made from rendered animal fat, burned for about 4 hours and cost a laborer close to an hour's wages to buy. Beeswax candles, which burned cleaner and longer, were priced entirely out of reach for ordinary families. So darkness was not optional. It was the default condition of every evening, and it had to be endured, not lit up. Out of that endurance came something that historians of rural Europe call the veillée, a French term, though versions of the same practice existed under different names, from Ireland to Russia to the Andes. Families and neighbors would gather in a single room, usually the warmest one, around whatever fire could be afforded. They would combine the tasks that had to be done anyway, spinning wool, mending tools, shelling corn, with conversation, storytelling, riddles, and song. Nobody invented the veillée. It assembled itself out of necessity, because a dark room was less frightening and less wasteful with 6 people in it than with 1. The stories told in these gatherings were rarely written down. They were passed mouth to mouth, elder to child, embellished a little more with each telling, and they carried the practical knowledge of a community disguised as folklore, which plants were poisonous, which neighbors could not be trusted, which roads flooded in spring. Long before anyone called it entertainment, storytelling by firelight was doing double duty as survival information, and the two were so tangled together that separating them would have made no sense to the people living it. What almost nobody realized, including the families doing it every single night, was that this activity was not simply filling time. It was running on a mechanism modern researchers only later gave a name to: cognitive offloading through narrative rehearsal, encoding practical, survival-relevant information inside a memorable story structure so it could be recalled by people who could not read. A folk tale about a wolf at the well was not just a wolf at the well. It was a flood warning, a poisoning warning, or a warning about a specific bad actor in the village. Illiterate communities were, in effect, running an oral database with a 90% plus fidelity rate across generations, verified by folklorists who compared regional variants of the same tale. Nobody in that farmhouse called it data compression. They called it a bedtime story. Before I tell you what a story about a wolf at a well has to do with a nation nearly panicking over an invasion from Mars, comment your guess below. What could a campfire warning from 400 years ago possibly have in common with grown adults trying to flee their homes in 1938? I want to see how close you get before I give you the real answer. That detail would matter more than anyone in a smoky 16th century kitchen could have guessed. Because 400 years later, the exact same instinct is what put 6 million Americans within striking distance of genuine panic over a story about Mars. The first real shift away from pure oral tradition came slowly, tied directly to two things: cheaper light and cheaper paper. By the late 1700s, whale oil lamps and later kerosene lamps burned brighter and longer than tallow candles, at a fraction of the relative cost. At roughly the same time, printing technology had advanced enough that books, pamphlets, and eventually newspapers could be produced far more cheaply than a century earlier. For the first time, a family did not need a live storyteller in the room. They could read the story themselves, out loud, from a page. Reading aloud became the anchor of the evening in households that could afford even a modest personal library, which by the early 1800s meant a much wider slice of the population than it had a century before. A father, or the eldest literate child, would read from the Bible, from an almanac, from a serialized novel arriving chapter by chapter in a magazine, while the rest of the family worked with their hands or simply listened. Almanacs in particular were a fixture, part calendar, part weather prediction, part proverb collection, part crude entertainment. Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac sold roughly 10,000 copies a year at its peak in colonial America. Parlor games filled the gaps between chapters, charades, riddles, card games, and by the mid-1800s, board games specifically designed and marketed for family use. The evening had stopped being simply endured. It had started being organized. And organizing it, it turned out, was extremely good business, which is exactly where the story's real turning point begins. In 1916, a young executive at the American Marconi Company named David Sarnoff sent a memo to his superiors proposing something that, at the time, sounded almost absurd to the men reading it: that radio should stop being a device for sending Morse code between ships and start being a household utility, his words, something people would buy the way they bought a piano. Sarnoff called it, in that same memo, a radio music box. His superiors at American Marconi shelved the idea. Point-to-point communication was the business. A box that broadcast music and talked to no one in particular, for no fee per message, made no obvious financial sense to men who had spent a decade building a company around the opposite model. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. By 1919, American Marconi had been absorbed into the newly formed Radio Corporation of America, and Sarnoff, now inside RCA, dusted off the same memo almost word for word. This time the company said yes. In November 1920, station KDK in Pittsburgh broadcast the results of the Harding-Cox presidential election to an audience that, by most estimates, numbered only a few thousand people huddled around homemade crystal sets. Within 3 years, that number had become millions. Within a decade, the device that RCA's own leadership had once dismissed as commercially pointless was sitting in the front room of nearly half the households in the United States. Not everyone was saying yes, though, and the people saying no were not shy about it. Educators warned that radio would destroy children's capacity for sustained attention, while physicians in several countries speculated that prolonged radio listening caused nervous exhaustion, and something several doctors referred to only as radio ear. Some American Protestant ministers preached that the radio was a Trojan horse for secular entertainment, and a small number of rural congregations banned radios from the household entirely, treating a wooden cabinet with vacuum tubes inside it as a genuine spiritual threat. In parts of rural Britain, radio was blamed for declining church attendance and for what one 1931 newspaper column called the death of conversation. Weimar Germany's postal ministry initially restricted private radio ownership out of fear that uncontrolled broadcasting could spread political unrest. None of these fears stopped the spread of a single set. It took one company and one specific programming decision to turn that risk into something people actively wanted rather than merely tolerated. In August 1929, NBC put a 15-minute nightly comedy serial on the air called Amos and Andy, and within 18 months, it had become the single most listened-to program in American broadcasting history to that point. Movie theaters in some cities reportedly rearranged their show times so as not to compete directly with its nightly slot. Restaurants installed radios and piped the broadcast into dining rooms, because customers refused to come in and miss it. What Amos and Andy proved was that radio's real product was never the technology. It was the ritual, a fixed appointment, every night, that an entire household organized its evening around. RCA introduced installment payment plans in the mid-1920s, specifically so that working-class families who could not afford a set outright could bring one home for a few dollars down. Nobody thought this needed solving. It turned out everyone needed it solved. The Great Depression, beginning in 1929, gutted the disposable income Americans had once spent on movie tickets, dance halls, and restaurants. Radio, once the set itself was paid for, was free. Movie ticket sales in the United States fell by roughly a third between 1930 and 1933. While radio set ownership continued climbing through the same years almost without interruption. Rural electrification programs were finally bringing power lines to farmhouses that had never had them, and a radio was very often the first electrical appliance a rural family purchased, ahead of a refrigerator, ahead of a washing machine. Urban tenement families crammed into shared housing found a shared radio in a common room became the one form of entertainment an entire building could gather around. Depression-era poverty and rural isolation, two forces that had nothing to do with each other on paper, were quietly pushing in the exact same direction at the exact same time. The result was a medium sitting in almost every home, trusted almost without question, at exactly the moment someone decided to test what that trust could be made to do. By 1938, radio was no longer a novelty anyone needed convincing about. It was the primary source of news, entertainment, and shared national experience for the vast majority of American households. Welles and the Mercury Theatre, on the air, structured the first two-thirds of the program as a normal dance music broadcast interrupted, again and again, by increasingly urgent news bulletins, describing a meteor strike in New Jersey that turned out to be a Martian war machine. Listeners who had tuned in even a few minutes late heard only what sounded exactly like a real broadcast being real-time interrupted by a real catastrophe. Newspaper switchboards across the Northeast lit up with tens of thousands of calls in a single evening. Some police departments fielded reports of residents fleeing their homes, and CBS itself faced a congressional inquiry in the weeks that followed. What the incident exposed was that the entire architecture of trust radio had spent 2 decades building could be turned, deliberately or not, into a weapon against the very audience that had come to depend on it. Nazi Germany's Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, under Joseph Goebbels, subsidized the mass production of a cheap radio receiver called the Volksempfänger, the People's Receiver, starting in 1933, specifically engineered so that most models could not easily pick up foreign broadcasts. Radio was treated as core infrastructure, on the theory that a population listening to the same state-controlled voice every evening was a population easier to align. Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats, 30 of them broadcast between 1933 and 1944, used the identical intimacy of the medium for the opposite purpose, reaching an estimated audience of tens of millions of Americans directly in their living rooms. The same technology, the same nightly ritual, the same trust, all of it could be pointed toward calming a population or toward controlling one, depending entirely on who held the microphone. 2 decades of trust, built one bedtime story and one nightly broadcast at a time, had just been turned into the exact thing it was originally built to protect people from. If you want to see how that same fire, the one families have been gathering around since long before candles existed, survives all of this and ends up passing itself down into the box sitting in your living room right now, subscribe, because that's exactly where this goes next. The evenings families had once filled with folk tales about wolves at the well had become, within a single generation, evenings filled with a different kind of story entirely. One written by governments, corporations, and networks, engineered to be remembered, believed, and acted on. The mechanism had not changed at all. Only the hands holding it had. By the time television arrived in American living rooms in meaningful numbers, it did not introduce a new behavior into the home. It inherited one that was already 30 years old. Television just added a picture to a ritual radio had already perfected. The voyeur's core habit resurfaced almost exactly in the 1930s and 1940s tradition of radio knitting circles and kitchen table listening, where women kept their hands busy with mending while serialized dramas played from the next room. Parlor games did not vanish either. Monopoly alone sold an estimated 2 million copies in its first 2 years after Parker Brothers acquired the rights in 1935, and public libraries reported some of their highest circulation numbers on record during the very same Depression years. Consider the distance traveled. A family in a smoke-filled 16th-century farmhouse, spinning wool by firelight, trading a story about a dangerous well because there was no other way to warn the next generation which water would kill them. A family in 1929 gathered in near total silence around a wooden cabinet, waiting for 2 comedians to perform 15 minutes of scripted small-town misadventure at exactly the same hour every single night. A family in 1938, hearing the same trusted voice describe the end of the world and, for a few terrifying minutes, believing every word of it. The tools changed almost beyond recognition. Candlelight became kerosene, became electricity, became a vacuum tube pulling voices out of the air. But the underlying need, a way to survive the dark hours between work and sleep, to make a room full of people feel less alone in it, never moved an inch. Radio did not invent the evening. It just found a new way to keep the fire lit. Every night you scroll through something on a screen, you're doing the exact same thing a family did by firelight 800 years ago, filling the dark with something worth staying awake for. If that idea stuck with you even a little, hit like so it reaches someone else who needs to hear it. If you've still got a memory of the last thing your family did together before a screen took over the room, tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you want to keep following this fire all the way to wherever it burns next, subscribe, because we're just getting started.